My name is Nora Higgins. I'm 36 years old. Most of my adult life has been spent working in places where things have to function perfectly, but the person making them work doesn't need to be seen. If you ask people around me how they'd describe me, they choose safe words: reliable, capable, steady. No one would say ambitious. No one would assume I wanted to lead. And for a long time, I told myself that was fine. I'm not the kind of person who walks into a room and takes it over. I don't dominate conversations. In meetings, I listen more than I speak. I take notes. I remember details other people forget, then quietly fix them before they become problems. Over time, that silence started to mean something else to people. My restraint was mistaken for agreement. My consistency was treated as something automatic. My family saw me the same way, especially my sister. This is not a story about revenge. There's no shouting, no dramatic exposure, no moment where someone is publicly humiliated. I'm not telling this to prove that I was right or that someone else was wrong. I'm telling it because there's a particular kind of experience that only exists when you live as the one in the background. This is a story about how credit can drift without anyone formally stealing it, about how effort can slowly detach from its owner, about how silence, if practiced long enough, teaches people what they're allowed to do to you. For years, I told myself that outcomes mattered more than recognition, that family dynamics were complicated and not worth disturbing. As long as I knew what I had contributed, that should be enough. I called it maturity. I called it peace. But looking back now, I can see it for what it really was: postponement. The journey you're about to hear unfolds slowly. It begins with moments so small that no one else thought they mattered, but I remembered every one of them. It moves through a phase where dismissal becomes normal, not cruel, not aggressive, just quietly assumed. Until one very quiet moment when something shifted inside me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't confront anyone. I simply realized that if I kept being silent in the same way, nothing would ever change. From that point on, I didn't speak again. I just chose silence differently. What followed wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. There were no apologies that fixed everything, no satisfying explanations, just clarity, and consequences that couldn't be undone once they began. I'm sharing this story for anyone who has ever felt present but unseen. For anyone who has watched their work, their ideas, or their stability slowly become associated with someone else's name. And for anyone who has ever wondered whether staying quiet was strength or just a habit. This is a story about quiet dominance, not over other people, but over yourself. So before we go any further, let me ask you something gently and honestly. Have you ever stayed silent for so long that people forgot you ever had a voice at all? To the people around me, I was useful. Not impressive, not threatening, just useful. At work, I was the one people went to when something quietly broke, when a process stalls, when a deadline felt suddenly impossible, and no one wanted to admit they didn't know how to fix it. I wasn't the person who presented the solution. I was the person who made sure the solution actually worked once it was announced. My title suggested coordination, not creation, and that distinction mattered more than I realized at the time. In meetings, I rarely spoke first. I waited. I listened to how ideas were framed, which words people chose, what they emphasized, and what they conveniently left out. When I did speak, it was usually to clarify, to refine, to stabilize, never to take up space, never to disrupt momentum. People appreciated that. They also learned to expect it. Over time, my presence became part of the infrastructure. Like lighting or Wi-Fi, noticed only when it failed. My sister saw me the same way. To her, I was the dependable one, the sister who didn't compete, the one who was naturally good at details, as she liked to say. She was more visible, more confident in how she spoke about her work, her ideas, her trajectory. She had a way of telling stories where she always stood at the center of them, and I let that happen. Family gatherings made the pattern obvious, though I didn't have the language for it then. When achievements were discussed, hers were framed as moments, breakthroughs, wins. Mine were framed as support, as contributions that somehow belonged to the collective, even when the work had been solitary. If she talked about a successful project, she'd describe the outcome. If my name came up at all, it was usually as an aside. Nora helped a lot with that. She's really good at keeping things organized. I couldn't have done it without her. Those words sounded generous. They weren't false, but they were incomplete in a very specific way. They placed me behind the result, never inside it. What I didn't understand then was how perception compounds. Once people decide who you are in a system, everything you do gets interpreted through that role. If you solve a problem, you're being helpful. If someone else explains that solution out loud, they're being brilliant. I told myself this was fine. I believed that consistency would speak for itself, that the people who mattered would notice patterns, not performances. I believed that staying grounded meant staying invisible. That belief made me easy to underestimate. I didn't correct people when they misattributed ideas. I didn't interrupt when credit drifted. I told myself it would look petty, or insecure, or unnecessary. Silence, I thought, was proof that I didn't need validation. What I didn't see was that silence also trained people. It trained them to assume I would always be there, filling gaps without asking questions. It trained them to speak over my contributions without fear of resistance. It trained them to think of my work as something that simply happened. At work, managers trusted me deeply, but that trust never translated into visibility. At home, my sister leaned on me, but never felt the need to step aside. I was reliable, I was calm, I was invisible in exactly the way that makes systems run smoothly while people take the credit. And the strangest part was this: no one was trying to hurt me. That's what made it harder to name. There was no villain, no obvious cruelty, just a slow, structural erosion of ownership. A quiet understanding that I would handle things and others would speak for them. Looking back now, I can see how clearly defined my role was to everyone else. I was the one who would stay late, the one who would double-check, the one who wouldn't make things awkward by insisting on recognition. I was the person they trusted not to challenge the story they were telling about themselves. And for a long time, I played that role perfectly. Not because I was weak, but because I believed restraint was integrity. I hadn't yet realized that there's a difference between humility and disappearance. That realization didn't come all at once. It started with something small. The first moment didn't feel important at the time. That's the thing about small cuts. You don't react to them because nothing appears broken. There's no blood, no alarm, just a brief sting you assume will fade. It happened during a work presentation my sister was giving. She had invited me to sit in, partly because I had helped her prepare for it, partly because I was always the person she checked details with before stepping into a room like that. The project itself had been complicated, disorganized at the start. I had spent weeks untangling timelines, restructuring deliverables, and rewriting entire sections that didn't hold up under scrutiny. I didn't mind that part. That kind of work suited me. Quiet, precise, necessary. What I remember most clearly is sitting near the back of the room, watching the slides move forward. She spoke confidently, smoothly. She explained the framework I had designed, as if it had come together naturally, as if it had emerged fully formed. At one point, someone asked a question. A good one, a sharp one. It cut straight to a weakness in the original plan, one that I had flagged weeks earlier and corrected. My sister answered without hesitation. She explained the adjustment, the reasoning, the logic behind it. Every word was familiar. Because they were mine, no one looked at me. No one turned around. There was no pause where my role might have been clarified. The moment passed cleanly, seamlessly, as if authorship had never existed. I told myself it didn't matter. After the meeting, someone congratulated her on how intuitive the solution was. She smiled, thanked them, then turned to me and said, lightly, almost affectionately, "See, all that prep paid off." Prep. That word sat strangely with me. Not wrong, just smaller than the truth. I laughed it off. I always did. I told myself this was how collaboration worked, that being acknowledged in private was enough, that I didn't need my name attached to every idea to know where it came from. But something about that moment stayed with me longer than it should have. Not the presentation itself, but how easily the credit had shifted, how naturally it happened, how no one questioned it, including me. Over the next few weeks, I noticed similar patterns. A conversation at a family dinner where she referenced a strategy we discussed late one night, presenting it as something she had been thinking about for a while. A comment from a relative praising her for being so organized lately, after I had reorganized her entire workflow. Each instance was small, deniable, easily explained away. And that's what I did. I explained it to myself as a coincidence, as shared thinking, as the inevitable blur that happens when people work closely together. I told myself I was being overly sensitive, but sensitivity wasn't the problem. Awareness was. Because once you notice the first cut, you start to recognize the shape of the blade. No one else reacted. No one else seemed uncomfortable. To them, nothing had changed. My sister wasn't gloating. She wasn't dismissive. She was simply continuing. And I was still enabling it. I didn't correct her when she retold parts of the story with herself at the center. I didn't insert my perspective. I didn't reclaim the narrative. Silence felt easier than recalibration. Part of me believed that calling attention to it would make things awkward, that it would sound like jealousy, that it would shift the dynamic in ways I couldn't predict. Another part of me, one I didn't want to admit existed, was afraid of what would happen if I spoke up and nothing changed. So I stayed quiet, and the cut, though small, didn't fade. It healed into something harder, a thin line of understanding, that if I didn't define my contribution, someone else would. I didn't act on that understanding yet, but I didn't forget it either, because from that moment on, I started listening differently, watching more closely, not to catch her out, but to understand how often this happened without anyone naming it. That first small cut wasn't painful because of what she took. It was painful because of what it revealed. After the first small cut, nothing changed on the surface. That was almost comforting. My sister didn't become colder. She didn't act entitled. In fact, if anything, she became warmer, more appreciative in private, more inclusive in conversation. It made it easier to believe that what I'd noticed before was an exception, not a pattern. So I adjusted myself instead of the situation. I told myself that this was simply how collaboration matured. Those ideas naturally blended, that separating ownership too precisely would make things transactional. And I didn't want that, especially with family, especially with someone I loved. At work, similar dynamics unfolded. I'd refine a process, streamline a system, and identify a risk before it surfaced. A week later, that same improvement would be referenced in a meeting by someone else. Sometimes a manager, sometimes a peer, often with no malicious intent at all. People would nod, write it down, move on, and I would sit there, hands folded, telling myself that the result mattered more than the recognition. At some point, that explanation became automatic. I didn't consciously decide to accept being overlooked. I just learned how to rationalize it efficiently. When my sister started speaking more confidently about projects we had shaped together, I told myself she needed that confidence more than I needed acknowledgement. When relatives praised her for thinking things through so well, I reminded myself that family dynamics had always worked this way, that someone had to be the quiet one. I began to anticipate the moments when credit would slide away from me. That was the most unsettling part. I'd feel it before it happened. Hear a story starting in a certain tone, see a conversation leaning toward a familiar conclusion, and instead of correcting it, I would brace myself and let it pass. I normalized it, not out of weakness, but out of habit. There's a strange safety in predictable disappointment. Once you expect less, you stop being surprised. And once you stop being surprised, you stop reacting. Over time, I became skilled at minimizing my own reactions. I told myself I was being emotionally intelligent, that choosing peace over ego was a sign of maturity. But peace built on erasure isn't peace. It's just quiet resentment with good manners. The language people used around me shifted subtly. I was no longer described as the one who figured it out, but as the one who helped. Not the architect, but the support. The framing was gentle, almost affectionate, but it placed me permanently in the background. I even started using that language about myself. If someone asked what I'd been working on, I'd downplay it. I'd frame my contributions as extensions of someone else's vision. I thought humility would protect me. I didn't realize it was rewriting me. My sister, meanwhile, was getting better at telling her story. She didn't lie, she didn't fabricate. She just emphasized her role, her perspective, her initiative. And because I never interrupted that narrative, it solidified. People believed it because it was consistent. And consistency, more than truth, is what most people respond to. What hurt wasn't that she was succeeding. I wanted her to succeed. What hurt was realizing that my presence made it easier for her to do so, without ever having to explain where certain ideas came from. I was carrying weight she no longer had to name. There were moments when I almost spoke up. Small windows where a single sentence could have rebalanced the story. I always close those windows myself. I think it's not worth it, or this isn't the right moment, or they'll figure it out eventually. But eventually is a dangerous word. It allows patterns to settle in. The more I stayed quiet, the more normal the imbalance became. The more normal it became, the harder it felt to challenge without seeming disruptive. And that's how disrespect becomes normalized. Not through a single act, but through repetition that no one names. I wasn't being mistreated loudly. I was being diminished gently. And because it was gentle, I kept allowing it until I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't just tolerating the role I'd been given. I was reinforcing it. I don't remember the exact moment I understood the role I had been assigned. There wasn't a confrontation, no argument, just a slow, undeniable clarity that settled in once I stopped explaining things away. Roles don't get assigned with announcements. They form through repetition. At some point, I noticed that people didn't ask what I thought anymore. They asked what I could handle, what I could take care of, what I could smooth over. At work, I was looped into conversations late, not to contribute, but to implement. Decisions were already framed by the time they reached me. My job was to make them functional, not to question their direction. No one said that out loud. They didn't have to. I was the closer, the fixer, the one who would stay calm when others panicked. And because I did those things well, I stopped being seen as someone who might want something else. My sister leaned into that role without ever naming it. When she talked through plans, she wasn't asking for input. She was asking for confirmation. When she said, "Tell me if this works," she meant technically, not strategically. My perspective was welcome as long as it didn't compete with hers. I became the place where uncertainty went to disappear. If she was nervous before a presentation, she'd call me. If something didn't feel solid, she'd ask me to review it. But when the story was told later, the uncertainty never appeared, and neither did I. That was the role. I was there to make things safe, not visible. What struck me was how natural this felt to everyone else. No one was policing me. No one was silencing me. They simply interacted with me according to the expectations I had quietly set. I was dependable, so they depended. I was agreeable, so they agreed over me. And I had helped shape that image. I rarely spoke about my own goals. I didn't frame my contributions as leadership. I thought that letting the work speak for itself was the most honest approach. But work doesn't speak, people do. And I had chosen not to. Family dynamics reinforced it further. At gatherings, conversations flowed around me. I was included, but rarely centered. When plans were discussed, I was consulted on logistics, not vision. When praise was given, it followed the same predictable arc. I was the one who kept everything together. She was the one who made things happen. The distinction was subtle, but it carried weight. I started to see how this role protected everyone else from discomfort. If I stayed in the background, no one had to renegotiate their understanding of themselves. No one had to admit they'd relied on me more than they'd acknowledged. The system worked as long as I stayed where I was. That's when something shifted. Not emotionally, but intellectually. I realized the role wasn't temporary. It wasn't a phase. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a position I had been placed in because it benefited others, and because I hadn't challenged it early enough. What surprised me most was how calm I felt once I named it. There was no anger, no urge to confront, just a clear assessment of reality. I wasn't being overlooked accidentally. I was being utilized deliberately, within boundaries I had helped define. And roles, once defined, don't dissolve on their own. They either get renegotiated or they harden. I knew then that continuing as I was would only deepen the imbalance. Speaking up impulsively wouldn't fix it either. The role was too established for that. Something else would be required. Not louder words, not emotional appeals, but a fundamental change in how I participated. I didn't know yet what that change would look like. I only knew that the version of me everyone was comfortable with, the reliable, invisible one, couldn't stay in place if anything was going to shift. And for the first time, I stopped asking whether that would make others uncomfortable. I started asking whether staying this way was costing me something I couldn't get back. The day something shifted didn't announce itself. There was no argument, no raised voice, no dramatic moment where everything suddenly made sense. In fact, if you'd asked anyone else, they would have told you it was an ordinary day, unremarkable in every visible way. That's what made it so definitive for me. It happened late in the afternoon, after a long stretch of work that had gone exactly as expected. I had spent the morning resolving an issue that threatened to delay a major project. It wasn't glamorous. It was the kind of problem that lives in spreadsheets and timelines, the kind most people don't notice until it explodes. I fixed it quietly, documented the changes, sent a short update. A few hours later, there was a meeting. I joined remotely, camera off, listening as usual. The project lead summarized the situation. They thanked my sister for stepping in early and making sure everything stayed on track. That sentence landed differently than the others had before. Not because it was worse, but because I felt nothing when I heard it. No irritation, no sadness, no urge to correct it. Just clarity. I realized I had reached a point where I no longer expected to be acknowledged. And that realization disturbed me more than the lack of credit ever had. Because expectation shapes identity. If you expect nothing, you become someone who receives nothing. And eventually, someone who believes that's appropriate. As the meeting continued, I found myself listening from a distance that felt new. I wasn't emotionally inside the conversation anymore. I was observing it the way you observe a system once you understand how it functions. I could see my role clearly now, not as a flaw in the system, but as a feature. I was there to absorb complexity so others could appear decisive. I was there to stabilize outcomes without influencing narratives. And I was there because I made it easy. When the meeting ended, I didn't log off immediately. I sat in silence for a moment, looking at my own reflection in the darkened screen, and I asked myself a question I had been avoiding for years. If nothing changes, who am I becoming? Not professionally, not in my family's eyes, but internally. The answer came quickly, and it was unsettling. I was becoming someone who outsourced her own authority, someone who let other people speak for her work, define her value, and shape the story of her contributions. And I was doing it in the name of harmony. That's when something shifted. Not outwardly, but in how I understood my silence. Until then, I had thought of silence as a personality trait, as something neutral, as restraint. I saw it as the absence of conflict. In that moment, I recognized it as a choice, and choices have consequences. That afternoon, nothing changed in how I interacted with anyone. I didn't confront my sister. I didn't rewrite any narratives. I didn't announce a boundary. But internally, I stopped waiting. I stopped waiting for people to notice. I stopped waiting for fairness to emerge on its own. I stopped waiting for someone else to validate what I already knew. Instead, I began to pay attention in a new way. I noticed where my work flowed, where my knowledge was stored, who depended on what I maintained. I noticed how often decisions relied on systems I had built and no longer touched publicly. I didn't feel angry about it. I felt focused. That focus was new. It wasn't driven by resentment. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about understanding leverage, not to use it aggressively, but to understand where I stood. Because until that day, I had been standing everywhere except in my own center. That evening, my sister called me, as she often did, to run something by me. I listened. I gave feedback. I was calm, supportive. She didn't notice anything different. But I did. For the first time, I was aware of the space between what I gave and what I claimed. And I understood that space was something I could either continue to ignore or start to navigate deliberately. The shift wasn't visible, but it was irreversible. From that day forward, my silence was no longer automatic. It was intentional. After that day, I didn't change my behavior in any way that would have been obvious to someone watching from the outside. I still showed up. I still did my work carefully. I still listened more than I spoke. But the silence was different now. Before, my silence had been reflexive, a habit shaped by upbringing, by temperament, by years of believing that restraint equaled maturity. Now it was deliberate, measured, chosen. And because no one expects silence to be strategic, no one questioned it. At work, I continued to solve problems quietly. But instead of stepping in immediately, I started observing the full arc of a situation before acting. I let gaps remain just long enough to understand who noticed them and who didn't. I paid attention to what people assumed would just get handled. Often that meant me, but I stopped filling those spaces automatically. When my sister asked for help, I didn't refuse. I just asked more questions, clarifying ones, questions that made ownership visible without me having to assert it directly. Who's presenting this? Whose name will be on the final version? How do you want to reference this later? They were reasonable questions, professional questions, the kind that shouldn't raise suspicion, but they subtly shifted the dynamic. I wasn't withdrawing support, I was defining conditions. And because I remained calm and cooperative, no one felt threatened. That was the quiet advantage. People tend to relax around consistency. They don't look closely when things feel familiar. My tone didn't change. My availability didn't disappear. Only my assumptions did. I no longer assumed my work would be attributed correctly. So I began preparing for the opposite. I documented everything. Not obsessively, methodically. Drafts, revisions, timestamps, decisions, and their rationales. I framed it as organization, which was already part of my identity. No one questioned it. Why would they? I had always been the organized one. But now that organization served a different purpose. It wasn't about keeping things running smoothly for everyone else. It was about establishing continuity, proof that didn't require confrontation to exist. At family gatherings, I listened the same way I always had. When my sister spoke about her progress, I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct her phrasing. I didn't reclaim moments that had already passed. Instead, I noticed how often she referenced outcomes without context, how she spoke in conclusions rather than processes. And I noticed how little people asked about the process. Most people don't want to know how something works. They want to know that it worked and who to credit for it. Understanding that made me stop expecting fairness from conversations. Conversations reward confidence, not accuracy. So I stopped trying to win them. My silence wasn't passive anymore. It was a way of gathering information without influencing outcomes prematurely. A way of letting patterns complete themselves. There's power in letting things finish. When people believe they're unchallenged, they become consistent. And consistency reveals structure. I could see clearly now where my contributions were indispensable and where they were merely convenient. That distinction mattered. I wasn't preparing to expose anyone. I wasn't building a case for revenge. I was simply positioning myself to make a decision from a place of clarity rather than emotion. That decision didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be final. The most surprising part was how peaceful I felt. Once I stopped hoping to be seen, I stopped feeling disappointed. Once I accepted that others would take credit if given the opportunity, I stopped being shocked when it happened. Acceptance didn't weaken me, it sharpened me. My sister still spoke to me the same way, still relied on my input, still assumed my presence was guaranteed. She couldn't tell that my silence now had boundaries. She couldn't tell that I was choosing what to give and what to keep, because silence, when chosen, looks exactly like compliance, until it doesn't. What they never noticed wasn't a single action. It was a gradual withdrawal of assumptions. From the outside, everything looked the same. Projects moved forward, deadlines were met, conversations stayed polite. My sister still called me when she needed reassurance. Colleagues still trusted me to handle things. But beneath that surface, I was no longer operating on autopilot. I started tracking my work in a way I never had before. Not because I planned to confront anyone, but because I wanted to understand the full scope of what I carried. I mapped systems, processes, dependencies. Not just what I did, but what would happen if I didn't. That question was uncomfortable at first. For years, my value had been wrapped in being indispensable in a quiet way. I told myself that meant security. But security built on invisibility is fragile. The moment someone else tells your story more convincingly, your position becomes negotiable. So I stopped assuming permanence. At work, I noticed how often decisions relied on tools I had built and maintained without fanfare. Shared documents, workflow structures, internal guidelines that people referenced without knowing who wrote them. I'd always kept these things accessible, open, collaborative. Now I kept them just as accessible, but more clearly authored. Subtle changes, headers with names, version histories intact, comments left instead of silent edits. Nothing aggressive, nothing that would raise alarms. Just traceability. My sister didn't notice. Why would she? Things still worked, and people rarely examine what continues to function smoothly. I also started paying attention to how often I was consulted after the fact, rather than before decisions were made. That pattern revealed something important. My role wasn't strategic in other people's minds. It was corrective. I was brought in to fix, not to shape. So I stopped shaping informally. I waited to be invited. And when I wasn't, I didn't insert myself. That created small delays, minor friction, nothing dramatic, just enough to expose how much had previously been absorbed by my early involvement. People didn't connect those changes to me. They blamed timing, complexity, workload. That was fine. What mattered was that I could now see the difference between my presence and my absence. At home, something similar was happening. My sister continued telling her story the same way she always had. She spoke about results, milestones, progress, and because I no longer stepped in to refine the narrative, her explanations became thinner. Not wrong, just incomplete. She didn't notice the shift because I didn't announce it. I still listened, still nodded, still offered help when asked directly. But I stopped volunteering context. That was the part no one saw. I was no longer correcting assumptions in advance. I was letting them stand long enough to reveal their weakness. This wasn't manipulation, it was observation. There's a difference. I wasn't setting traps. I wasn't withholding out of spite. I was simply choosing not to overfunction on behalf of narratives that excluded me. And something interesting began to happen. People started asking different questions, not about credit, but about clarity. At work, someone asked who originally designed a process when documentation didn't immediately answer it. At a family dinner, a relative asked how my sister had managed a particularly complex transition. She hesitated. Just briefly, that hesitation told me everything. It told me that much of what she had been presenting as intuitive understanding had actually been internalized through repetition, through proximity to me. And without that proximity filling in gaps, the story became harder to sustain. I didn't feel satisfaction at that realization. I felt confirmation, because this wasn't about proving anyone incapable. It was about understanding how easily competence can be mistaken for authorship when the real author stays quiet. The preparation I was doing was invisible because it didn't look like preparation. It looked like consistency. I was still dependable, still calm, still available within reason, but I was no longer cushioning outcomes at my own expense. The systems I built still ran, but now they left footprints. The conversations I participated in still flowed, but now they revealed what they previously concealed. What they never noticed was that I had stopped protecting the illusion that everything was effortless. Effort had always existed. It just hadn't been attributed. Now it would be, not because I demanded it, but because I had made it unavoidable. The reveal wasn't public. There was no email, no announcement, no moment where someone finally said my name out loud in the way I had once imagined. It happened privately, almost anticlimactically. I was reviewing a set of documents late one evening, going back through version histories, notes, archived files. Not out of anger, not even with a specific goal. I was simply following a thread I had been laying down for months without fully naming it. And that's when it became undeniable. The scope of what I had built, and how deeply it was embedded, was far larger than I had ever allowed myself to acknowledge. Entire workflows traced back to structures I'd designed years earlier. Strategic decisions leaned on frameworks I'd drafted and refined in silence. Even the language people used to describe certain processes matched phrasing from my early notes. It wasn't just that my work had been used. It had become foundational, and no one else fully understood how it fit together. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel responsible. Because leverage isn't just about control. It's about consequence. If something is foundational and undocumented properly, it's also fragile. And if it's attributed incorrectly, it becomes untouchable in the wrong hands. I sat there for a long time, not moving. This wasn't about proving I mattered. That question had already been answered. This was about recognizing that I had more agency than I'd been using, and that continuing to pretend otherwise was a choice. I understood something else in that moment, too. No one was going to realize this on their own. Not because they were dishonest, but because systems reward continuity, not curiosity. As long as things worked, no one would ask how they worked. And if no one asked, the story would never correct itself. The private reveal wasn't about discovering wrongdoing. It was about discovering clarity. I could see exactly where my sister's confidence came from. Not because she was incapable, but because she had been leaning on structures that made her success feel seamless. Those structures had been invisible by design. By mine. That was difficult to admit. I had made myself easy to rely on and easy to overlook at the same time. I could also see that if I withdrew suddenly, the impact wouldn't be dramatic. It would be confusing. Things wouldn't collapse. They would slow. Decisions would hesitate. People would feel uncertainty without knowing its source. That kind of leverage doesn't need to be announced. It only needs to be understood by the person holding it. And now I understood it. What surprised me most was how little emotion I felt. There was no rush of vindication, no sense of triumph, just a steady, grounded awareness of where I stood. This wasn't a moment to act. It was a moment to decide how not to act. I didn't want exposure. I didn't want apology. I didn't want recognition that came from confrontation. I wanted alignment. I wanted my role to match my contribution, or to remove my contribution from places where alignment was impossible. That required patience, because leverage, when used impulsively, burns bridges you may need later. And I wasn't interested in burning anything. I was interested in stepping out of a structure that depended on my silence. The private reveal gave me something more valuable than proof. It gave me permission. Permission to stop compensating. Permission to stop explaining. Permission to stop waiting for fairness. I closed my laptop that night with a clear understanding. Nothing needed to be said yet. No one needed to be corrected. The truth was already in the structure itself. All I had to do was decide how long I was willing to maintain it. And that decision, once made, would change everything quietly. Because once you see your leverage clearly, you don't rush to use it. You choose the moment when not using it costs you more than using it ever could. Once you understand your leverage, the next question is unavoidable. What are you going to do with it? For a while, I didn't answer that question at all. I let it sit. I needed to be sure that whatever I chose wouldn't come from resentment or fatigue. Decisions made in reaction have a way of recreating the very dynamics you're trying to leave. So I laid out the options honestly. I could confront my sister directly, sit across from her, list examples, explain how things had unfolded, ask for acknowledgement, ask for change. That path looked clean on the surface, but I knew it wouldn't hold, because conversations depend on memory, and memory is subjective. Even if she listened, even if she meant well, the system around us wouldn't change just because we talked about it. Patterns built over years don't dissolve through explanations. They dissolve through structural shifts. Another option was to make myself more visible, speak up more, assert ownership in real time, correct narratives as they formed. That approach would have required constant vigilance and constant emotional labor. I didn't want to spend the next phase of my life monitoring how others spoke about me. Visibility achieved through insistence is exhausting, and it often turns you into the person others quietly resent. There was also the option I'd been using for years. Do nothing. Maintain harmony. Stay quiet. Accept the role. It was the most comfortable choice in the short term, and the most expensive in the long term. That left one final option. Withdrawal. Not dramatic withdrawal, not disappearance. Selective disengagement. I could stop being the silent foundation that allowed others to stand so comfortably. I could reduce my involvement to what was formally recognized and structurally acknowledged. I could step back from roles that depended on my invisibility. This option felt irreversible, because once you stop compensating for imbalance, it becomes visible. And once imbalance is visible, it can't be unseen. I took my time with that realization. I asked myself whether I was prepared for misunderstanding, for disappointment, for being seen as less supportive than before, because that was the cost. Quiet dominance isn't about being admired, it's about being self-directed. And self-direction often looks like withdrawal to people who benefited from your constant presence. The decision point came not with urgency, but with calm certainty. I decided I would no longer participate in systems that required my silence to function. That didn't mean cutting my sister off. It didn't mean refusing to help entirely. It meant redefining the terms. At work, I would focus only on responsibilities that were clearly mine. I would stop absorbing tasks informally. I would let gaps remain where ownership was unclear. At home, I would stop preemptively supporting narratives that excluded me. I would answer questions when asked, but I would no longer fill in context for free. This wasn't punishment, it was alignment. The hardest part was accepting that this choice would change how people felt about me. Not because I was doing something wrong, but because I was doing something different. And difference unsettles systems that rely on consistency. Once I made the decision, I didn't announce it. I didn't need to. Announcements invite negotiation, and I wasn't negotiating my boundaries anymore. I simply adjusted my behavior. And because the adjustment was subtle, it took time for anyone to notice. But systems always respond to change, even quiet ones. I knew that once I stepped back, things wouldn't break immediately. They would hesitate. And in that hesitation, the truth would surface without me saying a word. That was the moment I chose. Not confrontation, not explanation, but an action that couldn't be reversed once it began. Because some decisions don't need witnesses. They just need commitment. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel urgency. That surprised me. I had expected some internal pressure to act quickly, to reclaim space, to make something happen. Instead, what I felt was patience, the kind that comes from knowing you're no longer reacting, but directing. Moving in silence doesn't mean doing nothing. It means doing only what needs to be done, without explanation. At work, the shift began quietly. I stopped volunteering for tasks that lived in gray areas. If a responsibility wasn't clearly assigned, I didn't absorb it by default. When someone said, "Can you just take a look at this real quick?" I asked a simple follow-up. What specifically are you looking for feedback on? That question alone filtered half the requests. Not because I was unhelpful, but because clarity was suddenly required. I focused on deliverables with my name attached. I documented decisions instead of smoothing them out privately. I let meetings conclude without offering unsolicited fixes. At first, nothing happened. People are slow to notice the absence of something that was never formally acknowledged. They just assume it's still there. But over time, small things began to surface. Deadlines slipped slightly. Questions went unanswered longer than usual. Decisions felt less confident. No one panicked. No one connected it to me. And that was exactly the point. At home, I moved just as carefully. When my sister called to talk through ideas, I listened. But I didn't jump ahead of her thinking. I didn't complete sentences for her. I didn't preemptively solve problems she hadn't articulated yet. If she asked for feedback, I gave it cleanly, concisely, without scaffolding her entire process. She noticed the difference, but not consciously. She'd pause more, ask follow-up questions, sometimes circle back to the same issue later, as if something hadn't fully settled the first time. I didn't correct her course. I let her feel the weight of navigating without my constant reinforcement. That wasn't cruelty. It was honesty. Because support that erases you isn't support. It's substitution. I also began formalizing boundaries that had previously been implied. I set clear working hours. I delayed responses when urgency wasn't justified. I declined involvement in projects that didn't align with my defined role. Each choice was small enough to be reasonable. Together, they were decisive. No one accused me of changing. They just began adjusting around me. That's how you know you've shifted a system. Not when people argue, but when they adapt. There were moments of discomfort, subtle ones. A meeting where someone hesitated before presenting an idea, unsure if it was complete. A family conversation where my sister's story lacked its usual confidence. I didn't step in. Silence now chosen did its work. What mattered most was that I didn't fill the space out of habit. I let the consequences of absence speak, not loudly, but consistently. And in that consistency, something else changed. I stopped monitoring how I was perceived. When you're no longer trying to be understood, you gain an enormous amount of mental space. I wasn't rehearsing explanations or anticipating misunderstandings. I wasn't preparing defenses for boundaries I hadn't even articulated out loud. I was simply acting in alignment. The systems I had supported for years didn't collapse. They didn't need to. They revealed themselves. And that revelation didn't belong to me. It belonged to the people who had relied on my silence without ever naming it. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about restraint, about letting reality unfold without interference. And once I stepped back fully into my own lane, I understood something important. I hadn't taken anything away. I had just stopped giving what was never acknowledged. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do. They surface gradually, the way small structural weaknesses do, first as confusion, then as friction, and finally as a quiet awareness that something familiar was missing. At work, the first sign wasn't failure. It was hesitation. Meetings took longer. People circled decisions instead of landing on them. Questions that once resolved themselves now lingered. I watched from my seat, calm, attentive, no longer stepping in to close gaps that weren't mine to close. No one blamed me. They couldn't. Nothing I was doing violated expectations. And yet, something felt off to them. Managers started double-checking things that used to feel automatic. Documents came back with comments that revealed uncertainty rather than clarity. People asked, "Has anyone looked at this yet?" A question that used to have an assumed answer. That answer had been me. At first, the consequences were absorbed by the system itself. Extra meetings, longer email threads, clarifying conversations that went in circles. I said nothing. Not because I was detached, but because this was the natural result of alignment. The system was adjusting to a more honest distribution of responsibility. At home, the shift was more personal. My sister started calling more often, but the calls sounded different, less assured. She talked through decisions more slowly, as if expecting something to click that didn't quite land. Sometimes she'd pause mid-sentence. "You know," she'd say, "I'm not sure about this part." I listened. I didn't rescue. I offered feedback only when she asked directly. And even then, I didn't frame it as certainty. I gave options, considerations, boundaries. She noticed the difference now, not as a betrayal, but as an absence she couldn't quite define. The first real consequence came during a family gathering. She was recounting a recent success, describing a process she'd used to solve a complex problem. I recognized the structure immediately. It was one I had built years earlier. But this time, her explanation faltered. Someone asked a follow-up question, then another. She answered, but her responses were less fluid. The story had gaps, not errors, just missing connective tissue. I stayed quiet. The room didn't turn toward me, but I saw a few glances shift. Subtle. Curious. It wasn't a revelation, it was a question forming. And questions change things. No one confronted her. No one corrected the narrative. But the assumption of effortless mastery softened. The consequences weren't punitive. They were informational. People began to feel the cost of not knowing where things came from. At work, someone finally asked, "Who originally set this up?" Not accusatory, just practical. My name surfaced naturally. No emphasis, no drama. Just fact. That moment didn't bring satisfaction. It brought confirmation. I hadn't needed to say anything. The system was speaking for itself. My sister didn't mention it to me, but she grew quieter for a while. More careful in how she described things, less expansive. I didn't interpret that as guilt. I saw it as recalibration. Because when a system stops carrying you automatically, you have to learn how to stand differently within it. The hardest part of this phase wasn't watching others struggle. It was resisting the instinct to step back in and stabilize things for them. I had to remind myself support given too early erases learning, and learning was part of the consequence. Nothing had broken, but nothing felt effortless anymore. That was the shift. The ease that had once come from my constant, invisible presence was gone. In its place was something more accurate and more demanding. And once accuracy enters a system, it can't be removed. The consequences had begun. Not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. By the time anyone realized something needed to be fixed, it was already too late. Not because the problem was unsolvable, but because the version of me who would have quietly solved it no longer existed. At work, the questions became more direct. Not accusatory, not panicked, just searching. People asked for clarity on processes they thought they understood. They wanted to know why certain decisions had been made the way they were. They revisited assumptions that had gone unchallenged for years. And each time I answered honestly, but narrowly. I explained what I was responsible for. I referenced documentation. I outlined boundaries. What I didn't do was absorb confusion that didn't belong to me. That distinction mattered more than anyone expected. Managers tried to reassign ownership retroactively, to recreate the old flow without fully naming it. They scheduled meetings, created task forces, talked about alignment, but alignment can't be restored if it was never mutual to begin with. What they were really feeling was the loss of an unspoken safety net. At home, my sister felt it more personally. She started checking in with me before things went public, asking whether something made sense, asking if she was missing anything. The question sounded careful now, not collaborative, cautious. She was trying to fix something without naming it. One evening, she said almost casually, "You know, I've been thinking, maybe we should work a bit more closely again, like before." Before, that word carried a lot of weight. Before meant when I filled gaps automatically. Before meant when outcomes were smooth and stories were easy to tell. Before meant when my presence cost her nothing. I didn't respond right away. I didn't need to, because I already knew my answer. I told her I was focusing on my own responsibilities right now, that I didn't have the bandwidth to be as involved, that I trusted she'd figure things out. All true, all final. She nodded, smiled, said she understood. But understanding isn't the same as acceptance. Over the next few weeks, I watched her try to adapt. She adjusted how she prepared, how she spoke. She sought input from others. She filled the space as best she could. What she couldn't do was recreate what had never been fully hers. And that wasn't a judgment, it was just reality. The systems she relied on were still there, but without my constant maintenance, they required effort, attention, ownership. She wasn't failing, she was learning what I had been carrying. At work, similar attempts unfolded. People tried to patch gaps with meetings, with consultants, with restructuring. But once the original foundation steps back, replacements don't restore ease. They expose complexity. No one blamed me openly, but I could feel the subtle regret, the unspoken realization that something valuable had been taken for granted too long to be restored on old terms. That realization didn't make me feel victorious. It made me feel complete, because I hadn't taken anything away. I had simply stopped providing what was never acknowledged as mine. And now, the cost of that oversight was clear. There was a moment, quiet, fleeting, when my sister looked at me differently. Not defensively, not resentfully, but with recognition that came too late to change the structure we were now standing in. She didn't apologize. I didn't ask her to. Some understandings don't need words. They arrive after options are gone. By the time people want to fix what they ignored, the system has already reorganized itself around truth. And truth doesn't negotiate with nostalgia. It just remains. The confrontation, when it finally came, wasn't planned. It didn't happen in a meeting room or over a carefully prepared conversation. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in the quiet space between things, where defenses are usually down. My sister asked if we could talk. Not urgently, not emotionally, just directly. We sat across from each other at her kitchen table. No phones, no distractions. The tone was almost neutral, which told me she wasn't there to argue. She was there because something no longer made sense. She started by talking about work, about how things felt heavier lately, how decisions seemed to take longer, how she felt like she was constantly double-checking herself. Then she paused. "I feel like I lost access to something," she said, "and I don't know when that happened." I didn't respond immediately, not because I was withholding, but because this wasn't a moment that needed filling. After a few seconds, she continued, "I'm not saying you owe me anything," she added. I'm trying to understand." That was the closest she came to naming it. I told her the truth, without examples, without accusation. I said I had changed how I worked, that I was focusing on what was clearly mine to carry, that I had realized I'd been taking on responsibility that didn't belong to me anymore. She listened. No interruption, no defensiveness. "But you didn't say anything," she said quietly. I nodded. "I know." She waited for more. I didn't give it. Eventually she asked, "Did I do something wrong?" That question held more weight than any accusation would have. I answered carefully. I said this wasn't about blame, that nothing she did was malicious, that the issue wasn't a single moment, but a pattern that had formed because neither of us had stopped it early. I didn't list instances. I didn't recount history. I didn't need to, because she already felt the absence. What I needed, I said, was alignment, not recognition after the fact, not appreciation in private, just clarity about where my work ended and yours began. She absorbed that. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then she said something I hadn't expected. "I think I assumed you were okay with it," she said, "because you never pushed back." I didn't disagree. I said, until I wasn't. There was no apology, not a formal one, and I didn't ask for it, because apologies fix emotions, not structures. What mattered was that she understood why things couldn't go back to the way they were. "I don't know how to undo it," she said finally. I told her she didn't need to, that this wasn't about undoing the past. It was about moving forward differently, or not at all. We talked about boundaries, about roles, about expectations. Briefly, practically. No raised voices, no tears, just clarity. When we stood up from the table, nothing felt resolved in the way people usually mean that word. There was no closure, bow tied neatly around the conversation. But there was understanding, and more importantly, there was finality. She no longer expected me to step in the way I used to, and I no longer felt the urge to explain myself beyond what had already been said. That was the confrontation. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the moment when the truth was acknowledged without resistance. And once truth is acknowledged, the work of pretending becomes unnecessary. Who I am now is quieter than who I was before, but clearer. I no longer measure myself by how indispensable I am to other people's systems. I don't evaluate my worth based on how smoothly things run when I'm present. That version of me was efficient, capable, and endlessly accommodating. But she was also fragmented. She existed everywhere except fully in herself. Now my attention is narrower, more intentional. I invest energy where there is mutual clarity, not assumed access. I choose work where contribution and ownership are aligned, where my name and my effort exist in the same sentence without explanation. This hasn't made my life louder, it's made it lighter. At work, my role is smaller on paper, but stronger in reality. I speak less, but when I do, it's from a position that doesn't require reinforcement afterward. I don't rush to fix what isn't mine. I don't volunteer for invisibility. And interestingly, people listen more. Not because I assert myself, but because my words aren't diluted by overfunctioning. When you stop filling every silence, the ones you choose to fill start to matter. My sister and I are different now. Not distant, but defined. We talk openly, but within boundaries that weren't there before. She no longer leans on me to stabilize her confidence. I no longer shape myself around her trajectory. There's a mutual respect that didn't exist when everything was unspoken. I don't mistake that for closeness. Closeness without clarity is just entanglement. What I've learned is that being underestimated isn't always an insult. Sometimes it's an invitation to disappear quietly or to step into yourself deliberately. I chose the second. Quiet dominance isn't about control or superiority. It's about authorship, about deciding where your energy goes and where it doesn't, about understanding that silence is powerful, but only when it's chosen, not inherited. I no longer correct narratives that don't include me. I let them exist without my participation. If someone wants my contribution, it comes with context and credit built in. And if it doesn't, I let the system adjust without me. There's no bitterness in that. Bitterness comes from waiting to be seen. I don't wait anymore. I also don't need to prove what I did in the past. The urge to be validated retroactively fades when you're aligned in the present. The most unexpected change is internal. I trust myself more, not because others finally recognize me, but because I stopped abandoning my own awareness in the name of peace. I know what I bring. I know what it costs. And I know when it's worth giving. That knowledge is quiet, but it's immovable. I still believe in collaboration. I still value family, but I no longer confuse loyalty with self-erasure. Who I am now is someone who understands that boundaries aren't walls. They're definitions. And definitions make relationships sustainable. I didn't become louder. I became clearer. And clarity, once claimed, doesn't need defense. There's a common belief that strength is loud, that if something matters, it should be defended publicly, forcefully, without hesitation. For a long time, I believed the opposite, that strength was endurance, that staying calm, staying useful, staying agreeable was proof of maturity. I was wrong in a very specific way. Endurance without ownership doesn't make you strong. It makes you available. What this experience taught me isn't that people are intentionally unfair, or that those closest to us are secretly adversaries. It taught me that systems, families, workplaces, relationships will always adapt to the behavior that costs them the least. And silence, when it asks for nothing, costs others nothing. My sister didn't wake up one day and decide to take credit for my work. That's the uncomfortable truth. She stepped into space that was already open, space I had cleared by staying quiet, by smoothing edges, by absorbing responsibility without defining it. I don't tell this story to assign blame. I tell it to name patterns, because patterns repeat, not just between siblings, but everywhere. In offices, in friendships, in partnerships where one person quietly carries the structure while another carries the story. The moral of this story isn't speak up more. It's deeper than that. It's this. If your contribution requires your silence to function, the system is already misaligned. Quiet dominance isn't about withholding. It isn't about making others fail so you can feel justified. It's about stepping out of roles that were never consciously agreed to and allowing reality to recalibrate. When I stopped overfunctioning, nothing collapsed. It just became honest. And honesty, while uncomfortable at first, is sustainable in a way quiet resentment never is. Some people will recognize your absence too late. Some will never fully understand it. That's not a failure. Not every story ends with validation. Some end with self-respect. And that's enough. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's this. You don't need permission to redefine how you participate. You don't need an argument to set a boundary. And you don't need to explain your worth to people who benefited from your silence. Sometimes the most powerful move isn't confrontation. It's alignment. And alignment doesn't announce itself. It simply changes what you're willing to carry. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt present but unseen, valued but unnamed, relied on but overlooked, I'd really like to hear from you. Not because I have answers for everyone, but because stories like this are rarely isolated. So let me ask you, honestly and openly, have you ever realized, too late or just in time, that staying quiet was costing you more than speaking ever would? If you have, share your experience in the comments. Someone reading might need to know they're not alone. And if you haven't yet, maybe this story will help you notice the moment when silence stops being strength and starts being a choice.
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.